Having talked about sort of the functions or the roles of political parties in America, let's kind of take a look back and see how these parties have developed over history. And we'll talk about five different systems that have kind of popped up throughout America's past. Each of them, you'll notice, is pretty much going to be characterized as a two-party system. So that is something we'll discuss a little bit later today. But at this point, suffice it to say that the two-party system has really had a moderating effect on the parties that tend to be popular. For the most part, parties are pretty calm. Right? We don't see a number of the radical types of parties that exist in other countries, and in large part that has to do with the two-party system. So kind of starting off, and again, we'll talk about each of these five different periods on different slides. George Washington himself, our first president, was very, very concerned about political parties, right? Earlier in this lesson, I mentioned that a lot of folks saw them as more or less equivalent to a faction. And so Washington warned against them. He was himself a Federalist. And so if he had to pick a side, quote, so to speak, it would be on that it would be that side, but he didn't really identify himself as a member of this party. In fact, Federalists themselves were not really organized into a political party at this point in time. Looking at something Washington said, he this is a quote from Washington, and this is political parties serve to, quote, to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration, agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one against another. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. So, take a moment and kind of think about what he's getting at, and particularly why he thinks these parties are dangerous for America. The main idea here is that parties divide. Right? As soon as you start thinking of yourself as a Republican or a Democrat, all of a sudden, everyone who's not on your side is seen as wrong or incorrect or just maybe misguided, right? However you want to describe the other side, right? Well, you're still talking in terms of us versus them. It's not us as a nation with different viewpoints. No, it's I am an sorry, you're not thinking of us all as we're Americans, let's figure out what's best, but you're thinking I'm a Democrat and I think this is best, or I'm a Republican and I think this other thing is best, right? So it creates conflict just by its very existence. Washington, again, did not abide the notions of political parties in his cabinet, but he also watched as some of the prototypical parties were developing, even as he was president. So our first party system is going to be federalism and anti-federalism, and we've talked about each of these two parties a little bit already. The the two camps, right? They wouldn't think of themselves as political parties at all in the way that we think of parties today. Certainly not at this point in time. But the two camps had their major dividing point on whether or not we should support or oppose the Constitution. Federalists, as we've noted before, were in support of the proposed Constitution, anti-federalists against it. And again, we've laid out some of the reasons behind it. So the early kind of leaders of these two parties would be Thomas Jefferson, and the Jeffersonian Republicans espoused the anti-federalist point of view, and then Hamilton and his folks were more on the Federalist, were more of the Federalist perspective. This particular sort of Federalist versus anti-Federalist mindset, or Republicans versus, sorry, Jeffersonian Republicans versus Federalists, would last through the first first two presidencies. That's under George Washington and John Adams. When Thomas Jefferson himself was elected in 1800, the United States enters into what is known as an era of good feelings. The Federalist Party itself really starts to decline for a number of reasons, and poor planning, or just poor articulation of their own perspective. One other thing to note is that in the election of 1800, this was the first transfer of power that we know of in the history of mankind without violence or bloodshed. Right? You think back to England or France in the medieval period. If some king loses, or like if you get a new a new monarch, or if new aristocrats come in, or some new military junta, whatever it is, they're going to be associated with violence and bloodshed, right? The old king was killed or defeated in battle. The military junta um, takes over the government, right? And there's going to be fighting. In 1800, we saw Thomas Jefferson running against John Adams, and John Adams himself a Federalist, Thomas Jefferson, as we saw, a Jeffersonian Republican, and so people were very, very nervous in the United States that when Jefferson won, well, is Adams going to leave the office? Is Adams going to tell the military to go arrest Thomas Jefferson, throw him in jail? Right, this whole Republican experiment could be in jeopardy right now. And so when Thomas Jefferson takes the oath of office, and that same day John Adams leaves the White House willingly, they became bitter enemies for a long, or they were bitter enemies for a while. They would since make up later in their lives, and become kind of rekindle their friendship. But this was a huge thing. Right? And on top of that, America is now entering its second decade of existence under the Constitution. And so now we have sort of figured some of the basic things out. And on top of that, the Federalists are on the decline, so there's really only one party in town. There's one group that's controlling a lot of the mechanism of government. And so here we have it known as the era of good feelings. Moving forward, if you're aware of history, right, we start to see this major divide forming in the United States. It's long been present, but it's coming really to the fore at this point in time. Andrew Jackson, our seventh president, he was elected on this sort of this newly formed Democratic Party. He created a party around himself. The Jacksonian Democrats were very closely tied to Jackson himself as a person, right? And so we have a lot of the spoil system and patronage that Jackson is doling out to his friends. He starts to, rather, he was all along sort of this populist military leader that was brought into office and promising to kind of be a friend to the regular people, and so he keeps that narrative going throughout his presidency, and really accumulates a lot of power to himself as a result of that. Other major leaders, among them several of the former Federalists, they see this and they get very concerned, right? Because this Andrew Jackson is flouting the will of Congress. He's saying, I'm going to do what I want because I was elected to do the things that I want. So we start to see a lot of pushback against this very idea that there's a single person in charge of all of government. And John Quincy Adams forms the National Republicans. At other points, they were known as the Whig Party, and they were more or less an opposition party to Jackson himself. This system, as you, again, if you're well aware of history, just flew off the wheels on the question of slavery. The Whigs themselves just could not figure out a way to keep enough people tied together while sort of being extremely vague on whether or not they were okay with slavery or if they opposed it. And so they just simply weren't able to maintain a cohesive unitary party. And so after that point, the Whigs fall apart. Moving into our third system, this is the system that will develop as the Civil War kind of is right on the cusp of breaking out, and then for several decades after that. The two major parties are the Democrats and the Republicans, right? The Democrats, the same ones that Jackson formed, again, the oldest party in the United States history. The Democrats were the party of the South. They strongly promoted slavery as a way of life, and very much in favor of this idea of states' rights. And Republicans, though, they were more located in the North, although there were some presence of Republicans, but to a lesser degree in the South and to the West. They very much believed that the federal government ought to be more in charge. For a long time, the Republicans didn't really take a stand on slavery. In fact, Abraham Lincoln, he's gotten the moniker of the Great Emancipator, he was elected saying, "Yeah, I personally hate slavery, but I'm not going to do anything about it. I don't have the power to do anything about it." So perhaps one of the first great Republican names that the whole nation knew was himself not taking a real stand on slavery. In fact, at some points was even saying, I don't like it, but what am I going to do about it? Civil War happens, and then after that, the parties had to no longer have to take a stand on slavery, right? Slavery is outlawed by the 13th Amendment. And so now, after this point, the Democrats still maintain solid, cohesive unity in the South. And in fact, the Democrats themselves will also see a boost in their overall power because the Three-Fifths Compromise no longer applies. So all those people who, before the Civil War, all the slaves that counted for 3/5 of a person, well, very few of them are able to afford to leave the South, and so now they don't count as 3/5, but as a full person. So the numbers that are counted for representation in the South go up dramatically, and so the Southern Democrats are really able to maintain a lot of authority, especially in the House of Representatives, for that very reason. Republicans, still the party rather start to morph to become on the side of big business, so promoting again this federal government, this idea of regulations to kind of keep competition down and things like that. Throughout this period, I mentioned earlier that most times America was a two-party system. We had the era of good feelings just a few slides back, but at this point in time, America is really trying to figure out what it is all of a sudden. A lot of historians and political scientists look at the Civil War as sort of America's adolescence, sort of kind of growing into its own, realizing that there was this massive flaw in its system, and most clearly that flaw is federalism. Excuse me, not federalism. Federalism is great, fantastic. Don't want to get rid of that, but slavery. So having sort of quote unquote fixed that problem, right? Still a lot of issues, still a lot of problems. Not at all going to say everything's great and hunky-dory. Not at all saying that. So, don't write angry letters to me. But with the question of the legality of slavery, right now we've sort of gotten over that question, and so, but what does that mean we are now? In this period, we see the huge growth of industry. We see this huge new kind of a workforce emerge and this new way of creating and building things, and there's an expansion in the economy as well. And so as we are sort of growing out of adolescence, right, we go through those growing pains, and there's a number of smaller parties that pop up to try to answer, hey, this is America. No, this is America. This other thing's America. None of these parties still exist, right? The Socialist Party is still sort of around, but and others of these groups have morphed into other sorts of third parties and things like that. But this third party system is really unsure of itself. And at the very end of this party system, we come to the fourth one, and kind of think back, like what's going on in the 30s that would cause all sorts of issues and stuff to pop up that will make you want to maybe get the parties to do something else. And I'm sure you all very well aware that the answer there is going to be the Great Depression. Stock market crashes 1929. This is after World War One. We have the Roaring Twenties, fantastic time, right? Great Gatsby. Hopefully you've read it. If not, check it out. Fantastic book. It's pretty short as well. Nice and glitzy and glamorous, but also it's got its very, very sad, touching human moments. But anyway, that's the world, right? Those are the 1920s, and then at the end of that, 1929, the whole world falls apart. America is hit with the Great Depression, but so too is the rest of most of the rest of the world. So it's sort of in these ashes that the next party system forms, and that is around the New Deal. So we got Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, is elected promising, hey, we are going to get government involved. Roosevelt himself was a Democrat, so his predecessor, Herbert Hoover, was a Republican. And Herbert Hoover, as president, on numerous occasions said, yeah, God, I feel horrible for all of these problems, but I don't have the legal authority to do anything about it. The Constitution is very clear. I can only do X, Y, Z. Look to Article 2. Congress can only do 1, 2, 3. Look to Article 1. Federal government can't help here. Not our job. So his whole perspective was one of laissez-faire, right? So hands off the economy. Can't do anything about it, even if I wanted to. Roosevelt says, nah, no. We're going to do something about it. Elect me and give me a whole bunch of power, and I'll do what I can to fix it. So he is sort of swept into office. He's given 4 separate terms, brings us through almost all the way through World War II. Just kind of a little side note, though, his New Deal, FDR's New Deal proposals were sort of like a drop in the bucket when it came to correcting the problems that were coming around as a result of the Great Depression. The thing the thing, not one of things, but the thing that got us out of the Great Depression was World War II. America had thousands of factories that were just sitting doing nothing, millions of workers who were actually not working, so they had nothing to do. We had tons of material resources available just waiting around that nothing to do with. And then all of a sudden, all of Europe just starts attacking each other. Hey, let's build some bombs. Let's build some tanks. Let's get some food out there, right? So it was really that massive demand on the Europeans' part for anything they could get their hands on that drew us out of the Great Depression. So, kind of a side note, I forget why I moved into that area, but bringing us through 1964, which you'll recall is also coincides with a shift out of cooperative federalism, which is where we are, 1930s and so, and into regulated federalism. And soon after that, we come into our current period of federalism, of new federalism. So we are now in the 5th party system. And we're in the 1960s. So with that, kind of think back to your history classes. What's going on in the 60s that, again, as we saw in the previous question, could shake up the party system? Hopefully your history teachers have done right by you, and you know that this is the era of civil rights. This is the era of Vietnam. This is the era where people are really starting to question the role of governments. Can we trust governments? Question social bonds between people, right? We're now 100 years away from the Civil War, and the civil rights movement, at least the black civil rights movement, is finally getting some traction. The 60s will also see a number of other civil rights movements, the women's civil rights, Native American civil rights movement, just Latino rights, the Chicano movement. Lots of these minority groups are sort of pushing back against the system. And so we have just this massive upheaval in America, right? Again, not saying anything about either of the sides right now, but just saying that no matter what people in the 60s and 70s believed, it was just just a very explosive period of time. Somebody lands on the moon. Neil Armstrong lands on the moon, and yes, he certainly did land on the moon, no matter what you find on the internet. The Beatles are present. John F. Kennedy gets assassinated. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated as well, right? Just crazy things going on in America in the 60s. And so there's just this big upheaval in all elements of society. Oh, and on top of that, we've got the Cold War going on, where at any point in time, people are thinking, golly, the Soviets could launch 150 nukes at us, or 10,000 nukes at us, and that'd be the end of us. So there's just this weird feeling all across America. Presidents lying about involvement in Vietnam. Just nuts, right? So people really start to question what government's purpose is. Can we trust that the government's going to do right by us? And by us, it's especially the case if you are of a minority group or a woman. So lots and lots of issues are coming around. And so this period of time is often characterized as one of a divided party system or divided governments. So divided government is a situation where the presidents and the 2 chambers of Congress, so President, House of Representatives, and Senate, are of different parties, right? So, you might have a Republican House of Representatives, but a Democratic president and Senate, right? So the idea is that Americans don't trust one party to do it correctly. So instead, whether it's this implicit or excuse me, whether it's this purposeful or just unknown action that we do unknowingly, we insert another check on government. So as you can see on the right hand side, right, there's very few periods where one party controls the House, the Senate, and the presidency. Uh, and the three columns, the left hand column, so you got the years, right? The years that Congress is meeting, then the president, then the Senate is in the middle, and then the House of Representatives on the right. So very few periods of time outside of the 60s, once we got out of that era, where one single party is trusted enough to kind of have all the power to control all the things in government. So this is a period of very strong polarization, right? So think back to that one of the early images that we saw today, right? The left to right polls. Polarization takes place as people leave the center, leave the moderate, leave the area where there's a lot of overlap, and they move further left or further right, right? So they move towards the poles of things. Think North and South Pole on the planet Earth, right? They're moving away from each other as opposed to that middle, the equator. So we see just a lot of major questions that really occasionally pop up to really just blow the system apart. And we're currently in this era of divided government, political polarization, where we're trying to figure out how to put the pieces back together in a way that makes sense for more than just 51% of America at any given time, right? It's kind of tough to do. So I'll stop this section now, and after this we'll jump over and look at the types of party systems that are out there.